It is good to be with you today, and even though this is not my home church, it feels like coming to an ancestral home. And over the years, since I was a little guy, periodically coming back here, so it is nice to come back and visit and spend a few moments, Sabbath hours with you. As ministerial director, I can't help but be excited about your new pastor. And if I could put a plug in, I'm the pastor to the pastors, if you don't know what the ministerial director does. And so I just want to put a plug in for your new pastor, and that is, some of you may remember the name Elder Murray Deming. Some of you may have had him as your college church pastor at Union many years ago, but he was at a church I was at, and we were wrestling about the next pastor, and we needed to make sure we're going to get the greatest pastor we could possibly find. And Elder Deming just sat there and listening. Finally, when he spoke, he said, you know what? We're going to take whomever we get, and we're going to make them a great pastor. And so as a church, we're going to be talking a little bit about that today, what you could do for your pastor. But I just want to make sure that you welcome Ben and Sheila, Pastor Ben and Sheila, into your congregation, and just make this the best church they will ever serve in their careers. And you do that, and it's going to be easy for you all to find pastors. They'll want to come here. So that's a plug there. It's also a small world, an Adventist world. Van mentioned James Shires, the conference president here. His son-in-law pastors in my conference. And so, in fact, I was just texting with his son-in-law here the past couple of days about different things. And so it's just a small world, isn't it? But the crazy world in which we're living, Van mentioned the fires. I could probably spend easily the next couple hours telling you about the fires and the destruction that we have seen over the past 4 years in our conference. And it is crazy. It's unprecedented when you start thinking about the fires and destructions, because I remember 10 years ago, we had fires. You know, California has fires every year. It's just part of the cycle. But now it's different. You all have earthquakes. Didn't used to really have them too much. We have a pandemic. We have strife. We have all kinds of craziness going on in our world right now. And I want to speak to that for spend a little bit of that time, because that really comes back to what I'm talking about today. People tend to, or at least are seeming to, become shorter-tempered with each other. They're stressed. Whatever's going on, they're stressed about what's going on, and that's where I think we have something to say to our world, and make sure our church is a special place to welcome people in this stressed out world in which we live. I want to tell you a story about a part of the world where it is very customary for the pastors' wives to have a choir. In fact, there's somewhat of a competition, if the truth were to be told, between pastors' wives and their choirs. And this particular pastor's wife had a choir, and they're traveling on Sabbath. And I don't know exactly what this rest stop looked like. In my mind, I think of kind of like a Love's truck stop, you know, where you stop and you go into the bathroom and you have to kind of wander through things before you get to the bathroom. They have it strategically staged that way. Apparently, this was a somewhat similar configuration, but a different part of the world. And as this pastor's wife is wandering, making her way to the bathroom, her eyes fall on something that she really wants. Now, when I say she really wants it, she really wanted it. I wish I knew what it was. I don't know. But she has this quandary of, okay, she sees this object that she really wants, but it's Sabbath, and she's thinking to herself, but I can't buy it on Sabbath, and she's not coming back this way anytime soon. And so she's trying to figure out, how is she going to get this object of her desire and still keep the Sabbath? And so she thinks about it. She prays about it, and then believes that God gives her the answer. She took it. That way she didn't have to buy on Sabbath. Now, you might be thinking, what? Shoplift on Sabbath? What happened about the other, there's remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, but what about the other commandment about thou shalt not steal? And, we're kind of like scratching our heads. But the reason I tell this story is because I run across too many Adventists who have a similar mindset. And what I mean by that is, no, they're not shoplifting on Sabbath. But they have a very narrow list of kind of do's and don'ts, and that's how they keep the Sabbath. And they just don't think about how other ways they may be violating, breaking the Sabbath. I'm going to spend some moments talking about that. And let's see. There we go. All right. One of our big challenges, I believe, with Sabbath is if you walk into an Adventist book center, an ABC, and you look for books on the Sabbath, you will find a lot of books on which day is the Sabbath. In fact, in our evangelistic series, at least the old ones we used to do, we'd spend at least 2 nights preparing for what day is the Sabbath. And it's a little bit like a dog chasing a car. Have you ever thought about, okay, what's the dog going to actually do with the car once they catch the car? And once people catch the Sabbath, it's then kind of like, now what? What do we do with the Sabbath? And we just kind of leave people just there. What do you do with the Sabbath? And by the way, I thought this morning's Sabbath school lesson was kind of interesting because, we'll talk about the word in a second. Because the Sabbath school lesson this morning was kind of like the warm-up to the sermon. But we've got to talk about Sabbath rest. And if you have your Bibles, open them with me to Hebrews chapter 4. I want you to see this passage. Hebrews chapter 4. And we're going to be reading, starting with verse 1. It says, Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. And then in verse 9 says this, There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Let's see, there we go. I got to give you the cheat sheet to this passage on Hebrews 4. Hebrews 4 is really talking about salvation. And so in talking about salvation, he wants to give them the best example he can think of what salvation is like. And the writer of Hebrews says, I got it. It's Sabbath rest. In fact, in verse 9, he even coins a new term we can't find anywhere else about Sabbath rest. And it's really kind of, he's using this illustration. And to me, to use this illustration kind of tells me 2 things. One is, he's writing to a Hebrew audience, and if they weren't supposed to be keeping the Sabbath still at that point, then this illustration makes no sense. Why would you use a Sabbath illustration if Sabbath had already been, changed? And so that's one thing I always kind of think about when I read this. But this is a powerful passage, and I want you to listen for a word, rest, as I read these 3 verses, 4 through 6. Listen for this word. For somewhere he has spoken about the 7th day in these words, and on the 7th day God rested from all his work. And again, in the passage above, he says, they shall never enter my rest. It still remains that some will enter that rest, and those who formerly had the gospel preached to them did not go in because of the disobedience. So you heard the word a few times there. But I got to share with you about this word. Now, this book was written in Greek. I know Van would know that, took Greek. But it's written to a Jewish audience. And it's quoting from Old Testament passages. So in their mind, they are actually, when it mentions the word rest in English here, they're hearing another word. And that's a word I got to share with you this morning. And that word is nu-auk. Nu-auk. Now, since I'm in a community that has German roots, you're familiar with gutturals. We really don't have gutturals in English. That kind of breathy, sound in the back of the throat. Nu-auk, and you got to say it with me, nu-auk. Nu-auk, yeah. It's not a word that you really want to say as you turn to the person next to you because you're almost spitting out that K sound at the end. Nu-auk. Almost a clearing of the throat. But here is this word that we often translate rest, and it's the word here. And it means all these different things: serenity, rest, peace, tranquility, security, quiet. And the challenge, the reason why we always translate it as rest is because we don't have these others as verbs. And so we end up letting Sabbath rest sound like we're taking a break, taking a nap, when it really means all this, tranquility. So we could just as easily, when it says they rested, I'm going to slaughter the English here. They tranquiled. They serened. They peaced. Does that change the flavor a little bit of what they're talking about? Think about it. Here's a passage that you know well. Oh, let's go back. Exodus 20:11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. But then he nu-auk on the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Peaced. God's not tired. He doesn't need to rest. He's at peace with everything that's just happened. He's serene. He's tranquil. It is good. And that is what Sabbath is about. There's a fantastic book, if you like books on Sabbath, from a Jewish perspective, by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, called The Sabbath. Fantastic book. And in this book, he describes this word that you and I are talking about, nu-auk. And he says this. He says, it is a state in which there is no strife, no fear, and no distrust. It's synonymous with the life to come. What's he talking about? He's saying Sabbath nu-auk is a little taste of heaven. Now, where I live, there is a wonderful and fun restaurant called O'Brien's. And I am let's see, too far. Let's go back. There we go. I'm a coconut ice cream aficionado, maybe a coconut ice cream snob. I judge coconut ice cream harshly. It doesn't want to be too hard. It should not be so hard that you have to chew it for a minute, okay? It should be soft, tender. It should be creamy. It just should be good. And so when I went to O'Brien's for the first time, I was going, okay, let's see what they can do. And this place has exotic flavors, from all over places, and you just want to try them all because you're going, man, this is great. But no, I stick to my true target is coconut ice cream, see how it's going to be. And as I got that little spoon, that taster, and I'm letting those flavors dance on my taste buds, what's in your mind, what's in my mind. It's the waffle cone to come, right? But that's what Sabbath is. Sabbath is that little taster of the waffle cone that we're going to have in heaven. Now begs the question, what is your Sabbath nu-auk like? Are you experiencing Sabbath nu-auk? Are you tranquil on Sabbath, serene, peace? And this is where, if a well-meaning Christian brother or sister was to come up to me and say, well, Jim, Sabbath has changed. I'm going, whoa, you can't take my nu-auk away from me. And I think too often we don't share the experience of the Sabbath. We so often come with the text, and that's important, to say what day it is. I'm not taken away from that. But it's much more meaningful when you can say, yeah, the Bible says this, but let me tell you about my experience. I got to share with you what nu-auk is about. All right. Now that we have the Bible framework, I'm going to go to a couple other places. The next one I want to look at is the scientific background of why nu-auk is so important for the Sabbath, and we're going to look at application at the end. But let's go. This one should surprise no one. No one in the history of mankind has ever had to live with the number and intensity of stressors we have acting upon us today. Now, hold this thought for a second. Let me ask you this question. What is the most important thing for a Christian to do? Before you answer, let me ask you this. What were Adam and Eve doing in the garden? What are we going to be doing in heaven? What is the issue of Revelation? Specifically, what is the issue of Revelation 14? Worship. Our love for God propels us into worship of God. We worship God. But the real scientific reason for nu-auk, if you're not slowing down and experiencing nu-auk, you're probably not worshiping. And that is the big challenge. And so if you take nothing else away this morning, or maybe at least this one key thing, let it be this. Stress, the opposite of nu-auk, is like kryptonite to Superman. Stress to worship is like kryptonite to Superman. That if you want to kill worship, just bring stress into the worship service. Have you ever tried to be quiet and read your Bible, and yet you had something super pressing on you, you're super stressed, that you're trying to spend that quiet moment, and your mind is just buzzing? That's what stress does to you. And here's the big challenge. I believe that stress is Satan's stealth weapon, because we accept it. I mean, I go to different churches, and this church, I'm sure, is an exception to all this. But I get to be in a different church almost every Sabbath. Some are healthy. Unfortunately, most are not. And I've even pastored one or two of these churches that we will bring stress with us to church, and if there's not enough stress at church to go around, we'll make some at church. And then we're like, happy Sabbath. Let's worship together. The trouble is we have accepted it. We just come to accept that like, well, it's just what it is. And here's the challenge. The challenge that we have is that we have reduced worship down to showing up at church. We'll say, yeah, I worship today. And my question would be actually, did you really? We say, just because you did church, just because you showed up at church, doesn't mean you actually worshiped at church. Let me ask you a question. Was worship ever easy for the children of Israel? And you read through the Old Testament, and they're always struggling with worshiping something else. It was never easy for them. So why do we think we are so much smarter, so much better than the children of Israel and worship? Worship's hard, and there's a reason why it's hard. It's a spiritual warfare. The last thing the devil wants you to do is to worship. And so if he can have you just show up at church and think that you worshiped, you can be tuned out, you can be doing whatever at church. You're there and you just go, I got church. Devil's happy with that definition. But to actually sit there and contemplate God, to be in awe of God, is a whole other ball game. And if we're stressed out of our minds, guess what we're not doing? Because it is physically impossible. And that's why Sabbath nu-auk is so important. And so let me ask you this question. It's a dumb question. Did God actually know what he was doing when he created Sabbath nu-auk? Knowing what life was going to be like in 2021. When life is crazy, we're stressed out of our minds, and God says, the only way they're going to be able to worship is with nu-auk, if they can experience that. So let me show you what the ideal environment looks like with worship. It goes like this. It says, making maximum connections in the brain requires a state we describe as relaxed alertness. This is a combination of low threat and high challenge. Keep that thought in mind, that thought. Relaxed alertness, low threat, high challenge. Think of Sabbath school, where you're kind of dialoguing back and forth. Okay, I got a picture for you. What do you see? What do you see in this picture? Back of an aircraft carrier, yes. All right, see how the edges are blacked out? It's a pilot's simulated view of an aircraft carrier. They say at this point, if you were to ask the pilot their mother's name, the pilot probably cannot even tell you at this point their mother's name. That the pilot's IQ at this time, functional IQ at this point in landing the airplane on an aircraft carrier is about that of a hamster. The only reason why they're getting down on the aircraft carrier is because muscle memory. They've practiced this hundreds of times, maybe thousands, and that's how they're getting down. They're not intellectually getting themselves down because they can't. You see, it works for landing airplanes. It doesn't work. Stress doesn't work with worship. And that's why God gave us nu-auk. Here, let me show you another picture. Look at this scan of a brain at prayer. Now, here's the catch. Notice, let's see if I can get the laser to work. Aha. Notice this area up here, it's firing. The frontal lobe is firing. Okay, over here, this is a brain at nu-auk. So you have to be at rest, at peace, tranquility, before you even go into worship, because that allows your brain then to be at peace. Now it fires. And it's going, wow, when you start contemplating God. And I can't help but think, Van, I don't know if you, when you think about the frontal lobe, if that triggers anything in your mind when you think about it. I think of Revelation 7:3, the seal of God in the forehead. And could it be that science is catching up with the Bible, where God talks about the seal in their forehead? It's worship, because the seal has to deal with worship of God. And I think that's actually just God. I mean, science now is starting to affirm that, and I can't help but think the mark of the beast is somebody who can't worship. There's nothing happening here. Remember, it's in their forehead and it's in their rest. They just can't rest. We could spend the rest of the time talking about that, but that's not our topic this morning. I want to introduce to you another word, downshifting. When we downshift, our responses become even more automatic and limited. We are less able to access all that we know or see what is really there. Our ability to consider in subtle, environmental, and internal cues is reduced. We seem less able to engage in complex intellectual tasks, those requiring creativity and the ability to engage in open-ended thinking and questioning. The very skills that you need in Sabbath school, that you need in church. And when you're stressed, your brain just starts kind of shutting down. And the very skills that we need for worship, we don't have at our availability. But God knew that. So God gave us Sabbath nu-auk. Because I know how I made you. I made you for creativity, for open-ended thinking. And this right here, you all know what this is like. You know, test anxiety. You knew the answer until you got stressed and all of a sudden you forgot the answer. Or how many times have you been in the shower and I should have said that. You know, it comes back to you. That's because in the shower it's low threat. It's a low threat environment. And your mind's just firing. You're relaxed. That's the type of environment we want for church. Now, we can't put shower stalls around here, but we can still create that same environment for church. Here's David talking about nu-auk. And he says this. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars, which you have set in place. And that word consider, his mind is firing. It's a deep thought. He's thinking about God. He's not distracted about all the other crazy things pressing in on him. And he can just sit in contemplation and in awe of God. That's worship. And now you're beginning to see how stress, when our minds downshift, how that's the enemy of worship, and why Sabbath nu-auk is so important. All right, we're going to shift gears now. Let's talk about some application. We talked about this verse earlier this morning when Kevin mentioned it in our Sabbath school. And let's see, there we go. Nehemiah 13:19. But let's apply this to 2021, okay? It says, when evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates so that no load could be brought in on this Sabbath day. But, okay, most of us aren't having to do hard physical labor like they were doing. That's not most of our world. Most of our world looks a lot more like this, carrying a mental load. Yet we never talk about this for Sabbath. I can't tell you how many different places I have been, and, you know, we won't do XYZ on Sabbath because that would be work. And yet we'll still talk about XYZ. We'll talk about all kinds of crazy stuff with each other, the mental loads. We'll give each other mental loads. And I can't help but think about these mental bricks that we still carry on Sabbath morning. We come to church with them. And usually we're lucky if we're carrying only one. Usually we can't come to church with an armful of these things. And then we try to worship. And this is why Sabbath nu-auk, that serenity, that peace, is so important. That we're not carrying this mental load on Sabbath so that we can do that one thing that we were created to do, to worship God. And oh, by the way, that worship has benefits for us too. Because when we can worship, I mean, how many times have you seen individuals talk about, you know, in our stressed out society, you know, here's 5 ways to reduce stress, and they talk about meditation. To me, I see that, I'm going, okay, that's my devotional time. And oh, by the way, that's a whole day I get for Sabbath, to just kind of push everything that's crazy in the world aside and reflect on God's greatness. We'll come back to some examples of loads that we typically come to on Sabbath. One of the things that is a load that we often don't think about, and I'll be honest, I'm as addicted to this thing as the next person, okay? I have pastors texting me, emailing, and I get both of these on this crazy phone, all right? And then it's not just what people do to me, it's also what I allow apps to do to me. I finally got smart and started shutting down notifications because I was having this thing ping all the time on me, and I'm just like, you know, I'm like that rat in a maze. You know, I got conditioned to always pull on my phone and be like, hey, what's going on now? And we have to unplug on Sabbath. Start pushing things back. What's interesting is they've actually linked teen anxiety. And it's not just teens. The fact that we can't unplug. That we have got to figure out how to help ourselves with nu-auk. A point we touched on this morning in Sabbath school, and I'll be honest, there was a big part of me that just wanted to really jump into the discussion and start stealing pieces out of my sermon. But I stayed quiet this morning because I was going, okay. But a lot of our Sabbath talk, when we discuss Sabbath, is narcissistic. It's about the benefits for me. When in actuality, if we look at all the Old Testament passages, half of the passages spend time talking about how we dispense Sabbath to those around us. We mentioned Isaiah 58 this morning. Well, more than there's two verses, 13 and 14, talk about how we keep it. But if you look at the beginning of Isaiah 58, it's about what we do for others. Here's the passage right here. And we alluded to this passage earlier in Sabbath school. But 6 days do you work, but on the seventh day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may nu-auk. And so the slave born in your household and foreigner living among you may be refreshed. We could spend the rest of the time just talking about this passage alone and what dispensing nu-auk. Dispensing it. Making sure that those around us are experiencing nu-auk. Can you imagine if our church's big goal was, you know what, you come anywhere near us and you're going to experience nu-auk? What that starts looking like? It's an amazing thing. One of those awkward, unfortunate moments in history was during World War II when Andrei Tupolev, one of the great aircraft designers in history, and according to Stalin's doctrine, he's decided, you know, I can get the best work out of somebody if I put him in a prison camp. So he puts one of his best aircraft designers in a prison camp and says, now I want you to build world-beating designs, world-beating aircraft, please. Now, I don't know about you. I've been to the Boeing factory, the old factory, the museum. It's gorgeous. They have this huge window there. They've got this drawing desk in front of this window. I'm going, okay, that's the type of place I would want to be designing aircraft. Not in a stinky, smelly, cramped, awful prison camp. Because guess what happens to your brain? We've already talked about it. It starts downshifting. When you're supposed to be super creative and you're supposed to be doing all this wonderful creativity and invention, Stalin says, no, I don't want that environment. Let's go for the downshifted environment. And now give me the best. It's crazy. Except we as churches do that all the time. We will hold evangelistic series. We will spend tens of thousands of dollars on an evangelistic series to bring people into church into a downshifted environment, and then we wonder why they don't stay. Probably because they were healthier than we were. They come into our churches and they see the unhealth there, and the healthy part of the brain says, no, this is not the right place. What it really means is we don't know the Sabbath either. We don't know our own message. We have to make sure that we are experiencing this so that we can share it. And oh, by the way, it's attractive on its own. If this is what we're sharing with people, then it starts becoming a wonderful, fantastic thing. Now, some of you to this point, okay, now what do you really mean when you say creating stress in the environment? Some of these things you already know. Like, for instance, mean, negative, controlling people. You know, the type of person that in a bigger church setting, I'll be honest, I remember I had several people in mind. I was in a couple of churches where the church was actually big enough, if I saw them down a hallway, I could duck out and go somewhere else. And hopefully avoid them for the rest of the service, because I did not want to hear them. I didn't want to hear about the negative, you know, the Eeyore, you know, type person. You know, everything's wrong in the world. You know, it's like, no. I want to be on Sabbath mode right now. I don't want to hear about every problem in the world. Can we? Or the controlling person, the negative person. Church conflict. Here's one we don't often think about: is no friends in church. Now, this is a smaller congregation, but if you're in a bigger congregation and you show up at church and it looks like everybody else has got friends in church, but you don't, studies show that person doesn't always stay around. Having no friends at church can be stressful. Think about eating by yourself in a restaurant. You know, everybody's by themselves. I've had to travel before, and you go to a family restaurant and you see everybody having a great time, and you know, you're going, this is really good food. I wish I could tell somebody about this, but you're by yourself. That type of stress. And it happens at church too. We need to be aware of that. Here's some other ways that we will share bricks with people. Getting to church. If you've got young kids, simply getting those kids to church in one piece, in clean clothes, can be stressful. Intrusive questions. I remember once, I'm at potluck, and you're at potluck, and I'm talking with one of my elders, and I'm trying to figure out, what do you talk about? So I go, how's work? Oh man, we got a new boss this week, and she's just been riding us, trying to kind of establish her authority and stuff. And where was his mind? Where did I take him? Straight out of Sabbath and right into the work week. And yet we think that's Sabbath keeping. Not in his mind. His mind, Sabbath is over, and he's at work. And so I'm saying, we got to be really careful with the way we ask questions, because sometimes we can drop these little verbal grenades on people, and suddenly Sabbath is over for them. I had a church, and Van, you've experienced this too, I know. You're like right before prayer, and all of a sudden, and this church was fantastic at feedback with the AV system. Just as you're about to have prayer, that special moment, all of a sudden, boom, and nobody can hear anything for the next 5 minutes. Stuff like that. And so all these special things that we do even behind the scenes can either add to or take away from our Sabbath nu-auk. We want children in church, and yet, sometimes there's this give and take that we have to have in church with children. They may not always be super silent, but also we need those parents too to remember too that sometimes their fussing can even cause issues as well. Sometimes non-nu-auk talk. I reference that being an outsider. Politics. Sometimes we'll just say, you just watch whatever news channel, and you're thinking, I need something to share with people. You're going to be evangelist for the latest thing that you saw on news, from the opinion person. Okay, I can't tell you, as the pastor to the pastors, that is wearing out my pastors. I have pastors calling me saying, I need a sabbatical. I can't take this anymore. Because they'll have both sides in the same church. In fact, even on my vacation, I've had pastors texting me saying they didn't know I was on vacation. But just as recently, within the past couple of days, talking about how stressed out they were. And then you add fires in there, and you add all the kinds of other things that are going on, COVID. But just the politics. We've got to be really, really careful about what kind of politics we introduce into church. And by the way, if you want to be treating your pastor well, be real careful with that one. Being an outsider, introversion, we most of the time create church for extroverts. When I was doing research on this, I discovered that in my church, that when survey results came back, people did not like the stand up and greet people time. Now, I'm an extrovert. I like it. I like it to go talk to people. You say, Jim, stand up and greet those around you, I'm happy. I know my wife, she's kind of like, just shoot me now. She is an introvert. And here's the truth. Half of our church is introverted. Pick whatever church you want, introverted. And yet we will design the worship service for extroverts. And we think we will go with the extrovert definition of spirituality and not think about our introverts. And that's an area we really need to be aware of. Bottom line is, we need to be thinking about dispensing nu-auk to those around us, as the Bible tells us. How are my actions in church contributing to somebody's blessings of the Sabbath? And one last thing. Yeah, come on, there we go. Oop. There's a really good book about adrenaline and stress, and this guy, Archibald Hart, is writing about Sunday, but it still applies to Sabbath. And listen to what he says. He says, much church activity is unfortunately geared to make us even busier on Sundays, as I say Sabbath, and I believe this can be a pitfall. If you're not slowing down significantly on your day of rest, you're going against God's intent as well as courting stress damage. I can't tell you how many different churches I go to, and it looks like the holding pattern at O'Hare International Airport. You know, you pull up the Sabbath bulletin and all the different things they have listed for that day that are coming after the worship service. And Van, I know as conference president, you had a few of those Sabbaths. You're going, I need a Sabbath from my Sabbath. But we're going, well, you know what? Everybody's got the day off, so let's just cram as much into this day as we possibly can because we got it free. And I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to push back. Is that actually what God created the day for? To see how much we could cram into it? Or did he say it's got another purpose? One of my things is, and even in my position, Van, I probably got to be an interim pastor. And one of the first things, like, they said, well, we got board meeting this coming Sabbath. And I'm going, well, it's without me. I said, I don't do board meetings on Sabbath. I've got to worship. And most, I'm not saying that it can't be kingdom stuff on the church board. It can be. There's going to be some stuff probably in that board meeting that I don't want to deal with on Sabbath. And I got to tell you something that as a pastor, remember this illustration we had? This is the view that most pastors have of worship. That we've got so many things buzzing through our minds. I remember as a young pastor, people would say, Pastor, they'd greet me at the door between services, and they would say, try to give me a message. And it took me years, Van, I was a slow learner, that I'd have to tell them, contact me later. Write it down, give it to me. Because I was remembering nothing. I'm about to go on a platform and say, oh, Pastor, can you make this announcement? And you're going, sure. And then you totally forget it. That's because you got so much stuff in your mind. Oh, by the way, you are preaching that day too. So you got that in your head. Your worship leaders' Sabbaths often look like this. And then people will sometimes come up to the pastor and start handing bricks to the pastor. Pastor, the roof of the church needs to be replaced. When are we going to replace the roof of the church? Here's a brick. Pastor, I am really frustrated with Sister So-and-so. Here's another brick. And before the pastor leaves church that day, the pastor has got an armload of bricks. And oh, by the way, happy Sabbath, and I hope you worshiped. I'm going to say, with your new pastor coming in, don't load him up with Sabbath bricks. Let him worship too. He's got enough stuff going on. He and his wife. Make sure that when they come to Shattuck Church, they're going to worship. Let them lead worship, and don't put too much other stuff on Sabbath. I want to share with you one last story. But before we get there, I want you to think about what church could look like if this was a church that says, you know what, nu-auk is what we're going to be about, because we want you to come in and experience this nu-auk. One of history's cruel ironies is the Andersonville prison camp, Confederate prison camp for Union soldiers. Now, Afghanistan's been in the news for the past few weeks. We lost over nearly 2,500 men in Afghanistan in 20 years. And we're thinking, wow. And it's tragic. It is tragic. Andersonville, in a span of just a few years, lost 13,000. And this is after the war is over. I mean, the fighting's done for them. They're in prison camp. 13,000 died in this camp, and it was squalid. And a lot of them are dying from dysentery because of the drinking water, the sanitation issues that they had. They literally barely had any room to even lay down. They were so jammed in there. So you can imagine what the camp conditions are like. Here's one of the cruel ironies of history. You see, one of the things at that time that definitely could have helped them, that curbs the effects of dysentery, is kaolin. Kaolin clay. And Andersonville happens to sit on one of the world's great deposits of kaolin clay. It's ironic. Now, you maybe are thinking to yourselves, unless you're a geologist and you've studied about kaolin clay, you're going, I've never heard of it. Yes, you have. You know it by its commercial name. Its commercial name is kaopectate. Kaopectate originally was made with kaolin clay. Here's one of the challenges. We as a church, just like Andersonville, we live in crazy times. You and I, crazy world. And yet we are standing on one of the great deposits of God's blessings with Sabbath nu-auk. Something that can curb the effects of the crazy stress that we have operating on us on a daily, weekly, yearly basis. And our world needs it. It is crazy out there. And so I got to call you to worship one more time. That as we talk about God's greatness to us, we worship a God who knew what life was going to be like in 2021. He knew it and said, I've got to have something in place for them. Not just so that we can focus on God, but he knew that we needed that break. That we could come apart. We could serene, peace, be tranquil, rest. I'm going to leave you with a verse. Hebrews 4:9-11. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest. May you experience God's nu-auk, and then may you take that blessing and dispense it to those around you.
Let's sing together about that wonderful tranquility and peace that we find in Christ as we sing our closing hymn, My Lord and I, first verse 456. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you with the Sabbath nu-auk, not only today but tomorrow and always, because we ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Dear friends, we have fellowship dinner across the way. We'd like to share God's blessing with you in the tranquility and peace. Please come join us.